So, as promised, I want to take a few minutes to talk about how to lay out the plot of short story now that you're going beyond the first couple of pages and really building your story to its larger size. The two models I've asked you to read are What Feels Like the World and Star Food, and each of them can very easily be mapped onto this little template that we talked about in class the other day of how a story works. Start with status quo, how things are, and something breaks the status quo. In What Feels Like the World, Brenda's given this gymnastics trick she's supposed to do, and that kicks the rest of the story into motion. So then the rising action, and there's a superficial rising action. Brenda's trying to get ready. But there's also a much more important plot, which is inside the grandfather's head. He's trying really hard to protect Brenda from things like this, while recognizing that that's not how the world works. He can't just magically make her not have to do things she's bad at, just like he can't make her father still be in her life, or can't do anything about the car accident that took her mother years ago. And so, of course, there's eventually a climactic scene, which in this case is where they go to the gymnastics thing. And then there's the end of the story, which is the grandfather is left standing there, unable to help Brenda as she has to do her gymnastics thing. The gymnastics trick itself isn't in the story, because that never was the point of the story. We know Brenda's not going to be able to do it. That's not her skill set. So the story follows these 4 steps like any story does. You can say the exact same thing, of course, about Star Food. You can see that in Star Food the status quo is broken when there's this shoplifter that appears and Dale doesn't catch the shoplifter. And there's a superficial plot, which is Dale realizing he's supposed to be catching the shoplifter, and along the way, his parents and he have some interactions. But what's really going on is inside Dale. Through the whole story, he's grappling with the fact that his father wants him to be one kind of person, his mother wants him to be a different kind of person, and he has to figure out which of those two things he's going to be. For him, that's not a simple question. It's something he really has to grapple with. So the climax comes when he finally does catch the shoplifter, and then decides to let her go. And that leaves us with a final scene, the denouement or the resolution, where he's left with the consequences of what he has done. Okay, so each of these stories very quickly can be mapped onto that basic idea. What I want to show you in the next few minutes is how differently the two stories get through those steps. Those 4 things exist in both stories. I can define them in just about 100 to 200 words each easily. But the two writers take 2 totally different approaches to get there. And so I want to show you what those are. So we're going to start with What Feels Like the World. If you look at this list here, What Feels Like the World is unbelievably straightforward. It basically contains a series of scenes, and I've put them in blue here, with one flashback in the middle of the story, and then some summary stuff that happens that even in the case of the main summary text here still contains a bit of a scene. Now there are little pieces of information thrown into the scenes that might count as flashback and so on, but in a basic structural way, the story goes scene of Brenda practicing and her grandfather's watching, scene at breakfast, which is like a few minutes later, scene of driving her to school a few minutes later. Then we learn a little bit of a summary, like what are their days like in general, and that leads into a scene of the grandfather while she's at school. Not so surprising. That's how we know it's the grandfather's story and not Brenda's. We don't go to the school. Once he drops her off, we don't know what happens there. We stick with him and what's happening to him. Then, a scene with him having lunch with Miss Eberhard. Great. That leads to a flashback scene because there was a time that Mrs. Eberhard and her husband had come over, and her husband had said some very insensitive things. But then we come back to the story. The end of the school day. Grandfather picks up Brenda. Then a scene in between that and dinner. They have a conversation. Then they have dinner. Finally, they go to the school. The entire story takes place in about 12 to 14 hours. And it's very straightforward. Yes, there's one brief interruption for a flashback. Yes, there's one passage of generalized summary. But overall, it just goes through the day. Okay. On the other hand, you can do something incredibly different with your story while still fitting in the basic 4 steps of story plot. Star Food, I had to break down into 15 parts. The first 2 of them are outliers in that they're not exactly any of those given things that are color-coded. The first thing there is a combination of flashback and of a scene, Dale with his father, in general, and at one particular moment. Then there's Dale's mother, and we get a summary of kind of what they talk about, and a flashback built into that. All of that happens before we even really get into the story. Then, steps 3 through 15, the shoplifter has come in, and you see that, like in What Feels Like the World, there's a large amount of blue, scenes 3, 5, 6, 8, 10, 11, 13, 14, 15. But there are 2 pretty major flashbacks, and they're both in red here. And then there are 2 pretty major passages of summary in between. And 15 steps instead of 10, and maybe most interestingly, it's not in chronological order exactly. It's kind of in chronological order. The scene of Dale letting her steal immediately gives way to a flashback to earlier. Then we come back to the shoplifter the second time she comes. Then we stay on that same day, the second time she comes, and Dale talks to his father. But then we go to another flashback. Then we get back to the story where he talks to his mother after the second shoplifting scene. But from that moment, we get a long summary, and several days pass, and we just kind of get a basic idea of what happens until the shoplifter comes in for the third time. So that leads to another scene, which is Dale and his father that same night trying to talk about this, which then leads to a new summary because Dale's father introduces a new character. He hired a security guard. Well, once we know that, Dale realizes he has to do his job. So there's a scene of Dale sitting on the roof having this major life breakthrough, or so he thinks. We think that's the climax of the story. But it turns out, when the shoplifter comes in, step 14, and he catches her, okay, that's right, that's it, that makes sense, that's the resolution. No, it isn't, because he decides to let her go. So we think step 13 is the climax. We think step 14 is going to be the resolution of that. And then we realize we were wrong. He's changed his mind. He's not going to get her in trouble. He lets her go, and then there's a totally different resolution in the aftermath of that. So think about how different that is. What Feels Like the World, all one day, step after step after step. But it definitely has enough scenes for us to understand what's happening. Star Food, this takes place over a couple of months, and it flashes back several years. And then the main story itself, yeah, there's scene after scene after scene, but multiple flashbacks, multiple long summaries. And in the end, it is chronological, from the first theft to the last time when he lets her go. But it jumps around in order to get there. So with your story, there's no right way to do that. The goal for your story is, just like in What Feels Like the World, your status quo is broken, the rising action leads you to a climax, and then we know where things are at the end. Same thing in Star Food. Status quo is broken, rising action leads to a climax, and then we know where things are at the end. They just get along that path in unbelievably different ways. It's the same path, but charted differently. So there you go. Good luck with your stories. Let me know what questions you've got.